Good afternoon, everyone. This is Annie Axe, Director of Health Policy and Innovation at NHPCO. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar. We will be focusing on telehealth in the age of COVID-19. A couple of housekeeping items to get us started. Everyone is muted. If you have a question, please submit that through the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will be monitoring that and definitely stop and talk and discuss some of the questions that are submitted. I want to introduce the other folks that are on the panelist line. We have Judy Lund-Person, Vice President of Regulatory and Compliance. She will be talking through all of the details of the recently released telehealth requirements. We have Lori Bishop, Vice President of Palliative and Advanced Care, who will be helping me in moderating the Q&A, and Hope Foss, the Compliance and Quality Liaison at NHPCO. She will be running our slides. First, I'd like to introduce Ido Banik, the President and CEO of NHPCO. He would like to offer some welcoming remarks.
Thank you, Annie, and good afternoon, everybody. I really appreciate you joining the webinar, this one focusing on telehealth. We know everybody's working around the clock, really around the clock on all of this, and this is obviously a crazy time, and for you to be taking an hour off of this, we want to make it worth your while. Thankfully, CMS released some guidance last night, and we have a lot of information to share about new regulatory flexibilities and rules in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Importantly, CMS granted blanket Medicare waivers for hospice providers and expanded the use of telehealth for hospice visits. We'll go through all of that. This couldn't have been possible without our advocacy at NHPCO, without your advocacy as our members. We had a very successful advocacy week last week. We had thousands and thousands of outreach efforts to CMS and to Congress. Those things do make a difference. We've been advocating for these changes really for the last month so that you all can continue to provide uninterrupted, person-centered care to patients and families during this national emergency. We know that the needs are going to be exponential. The folks who are going to need help in certain areas are really going to outstrip our ability to provide one-on-one, hands-on care. And so any flexibilities we can receive, and we did receive a number, are going to be incredibly helpful. We're so excited to have the opportunity to provide you with an overview of the guidance that was released yesterday. We'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. And with that, and without further ado, I wanted to invite Judy Lund-Person to kick things off. And again, thank you all for the work that you're all doing every day. It is so appreciated and so important. Judy.
Thank you so much, Ido, and I would echo that. And we also want to say to all of you who are on the line and who are out in the field that all of us at NHPCO think of you every moment of every day. And what we do for you so that you can do what you do in the best way possible. So let's get started, because there's a lot of very exciting stuff today, and we want to really go right through it. So if you go to the next slide, Hope, and this is our first, go ahead, and this is our first bonus. So this morning, I'm sitting at my computer in my home office, and I get an email from one of our colleagues who says, did you know that CMS has suspended audits? And so I start digging, and so go to the next slide, and I'll show you what we found. So breaking news, CMS has the question in the FAQs, and the link to the source of this information is at the bottom of your screen. But the question for this is provider burden relief kind of is the category. So is CMS suspending most Medicare fee-for-service medical review during the public health emergency? And the answer is yes. So this is something that NHPCO asked for way back. I know for all of us, it probably feels like it was 6 months ago, it was 2 weeks ago. But here, this is the list of all the suspensions of audits. TPE, No post-payment review by the MAC, the SMRC, or the RAC. No ADRs will be issued. And most importantly, TPE reviews that are in process will be suspended and claims will be released and paid. Also, the post-pay MAC, SMRC, and RAC reviews suspended and released from review. The suspension of medical review will be for the duration of the public health emergency. I don't think any of us really know exactly when that will be, but this is absolutely wonderful news. And I know you share the excitement I have for making sure that this is something that we can kind of set aside for the moment. Doesn't mean it's not going to come back, but definitely for now, it's not anywhere close to the top of what you need to be worrying about. Next slide, please. So remember last week when we were celebrating that the CARES Act passed in the Congress and was signed into law by the President on Friday. It goes back to an effective date of January 31st, 2020, which is the effective date of the public health emergency. So the CARES Act is the legislative vehicle that we tucked in the ability of hospices to do face-to-face encounters through telehealth. It's important for us to note that this is only available during a period of national emergency. So once we get past the pandemic, we will go back to face-to-face having to be done in person. Next slide. So let's start with the focus on telehealth, and I want to go through what the interim final rule has to say about it. And sorry, we don't have anything more creative than interim final rule, but it'll get us where we need to go, I think. So next slide. So it posted late yesterday afternoon, and the hospice provisions in it are really 3. So we've been waiting for some guidance from CMS on how the face-to-face encounter was going to work through telehealth since the law passed. It has that. It has some details on billing, but not all the information that we need. And then it has information on the ability of your hospice to provide routine home care through telehealth as well. This is what they call an interim final rule. So it has the opportunity for comment, and at this point, we're expecting that the comments will be due on or about June the 30th, but it could wiggle around just a little bit. I don't know exactly what our date will be because this is not officially posted for public inspection yet. Next slide. So I thought it was important for us to kind of see what CMS has said about what their goal is. And for me, I guess in some ways it's like, okay, this does make sense. So home health agencies and hospices, more flexibility, no change in payment rates, minimize exposure risk, patients, clinicians, and the general public, all of those are important ones. And then just at the bottom, and I won't put the source on every slide. So the source for this part of the presentation is this link, which is where the 220 pages of the final rule, of the interim final rule live. Next slide. So let's start with what is now allowed with hospice face-to-face using telehealth. And we can sort of assume that this is close to final. It is, still, it's not the same as proposed and final rulemaking, but so we'll just go with it, and we can't really worry about the details of that today. We really need to get this out the door. So what the changes did was change the regulations at 418.22A4, which is, this is the eligibility section of subpart B in the hospice regulations, and it is allowing the use of telecommunications technology. And so we'll talk about exactly what they're saying in this rule, and then we'll talk about what we heard just an hour ago on the CMS stakeholder call for hospice and home health. So as it was when it was an in-person face-to-face visit, the visit or the encounter only for recertification is not separately billable, but considered administrative expense. That is no change from when we were seeing this only as a face-to-face in-person visit. Next slide. So here's where it gets added, and this is what we have. You see this big sign up there that says old. This is the certification of terminal illness as it stands today, but we have in the next slide then where the new telehealth gets added. And so let's go to the next slide and we'll see this new slide. So here is where you see it's during a public health emergency, may occur via telecommunications technology. And so then keep looking down to like the third or fourth line from the bottom. Audio-visual equipment permitting two-way real-time interactive communication. And that's the language we are seeing throughout. So we have some questions coming in about, are the slides going to be available? And absolutely yes. After this is over, we will post them on the COVID-19 page for NHPCO on the NHPCO website. So thank you for that question. Okay, let's go next to the technology requirements. This is, so in the old days, last week, we had telehealth where you had an originating site. And there was a lot of confusion about who could be an originating site, and a lot of the older telehealth provisions had that language in it. So originating site can now be the patient's home, and so you can do telehealth through any of this technology. Now, this is where I want to jump in and say what we heard an hour ago, and maybe Annie, you can help me. I bet some of you were on the CMS call for home health providers, and we chided CMS for saying this is for home health providers and didn't include hospice in it. And their response back to us last night was, we'll add hospice going forward in any of these national stakeholder calls. So what we heard was, if you could only do telehealth with a telephone, would that count? And the answer from CMS was yes. Now, Annie, if you want to add any more to that, I would love to hear kind of what you heard on that call today.
Yeah, happy to, Judy. And I have the transcript from that call with CMS, and you are right. That question was asked by a participant whether telephone only audio will count. And they said in the latest guidance that was put out yesterday, telephone will count. And so these visits can be done by telephone only.
Thank you.
After reading the rule, the preference is to have both the audio and visual, but telephone will count according to what they said on that call.
Yeah, that's a really helpful addition, I think, as we're trying to figure out how to navigate some of this. I know some of the questions we've been fielding in our COVID email box are, what if we can't get into the patient's home and all they have is their landline, or all they have is a flip phone, and certainly, not some of our patients won't have video capability, or also in the nursing home, same kind of thing. So we will want to add that to the possibilities here before we put the slides up on our website. Next slide, please. All right, so CMS does address what happens, and this is similar to what we've seen when the face-to-face encounter was in person only. So what happens if there is direct patient care that's needed during the course of the face-to-face encounter? The guidance here is the physician or MP may bill for the direct care services under the physician fee schedule. And then I think the questions that are now starting to come in is, okay, that's fine, but how do we bill that if the physician or NP is billing through the hospice? And that is, if we go to the next slide, that is one of our unanswered questions. So we have a lot of guidance, and a week or so ago when we had the big announcement about the expansion of telehealth, we had a lot of traffic on our email with questions about, does this telehealth expansion apply to hospice? And the telehealth expansion that was announced by CMS last week applied to Part B. And so now we're kind of trying to sort out, okay, what parts of this will also apply to Part A? Is there a special code that needs to be used? And those are questions that we don't necessarily know the answer to at this point. So we have the place of service code that is available on the claim if you were filing through Part B. And then we don't know some of the other, we don't know some of the answers to these other billing related questions. So we're continuing to work on that. In fact, we're working on it this afternoon with a couple of our billing experts, as well as with our colleagues at CMS. Hopefully we'll get an answer soon. I don't know the answer at the moment, but they've been very, very responsive at this point. Next slide, please. Okay, so the second part of the interim final rule relates to using telehealth for routine home care. And I don't know about you, but for me, to hear that you could actually, CMS actually say, yes, you can do telehealth for routine home care is a really great thing. So let's see exactly what they've said. Next slide. So they've said, and I think we would know this, knowing hospice as we do, that you want to make sure that they, whatever the technology that you're using is included in the plan of care, is tied to specific patient needs, and identified as you develop that individualized patient's plan of care. And then look at that last bullet, description of how the technology will achieve the goals that you have identified in the plan of care. So we've got, you know, I think those are pretty basic things. I think that the biggest thing that I hear providers talking about is to make sure that you do a very comprehensive detail in the plan of care about how telehealth is going to work for this patient at this point in time. So those are all going to be a part of it. Can you look at the next slide, please? So the changes for this are in the section of the hospice regulations, which is 418-204. This is old. This is like yesterday's information, is where continuous care is, respite care is, and bereavement counseling are. So if we go to the next slide, then we'll see this. We have a whole new section called use of technology and furnishing services during a public health emergency. So you can see where this is, and you can see all the requirements here about the plan of care and all of that. So it doesn't change any of our COPs, which are subparts C and D, but it does change this section of the hospice regulations. Next slide, please. So I put this slide in because I know we've had a fair amount of chatter and conversation about the language remote patient monitoring. And so the exciting thing, and this is the exciting thing in the hospice regulatory nerd world, I guess is what we would call us, is that they are mentioning technologies such as telemedicine and remote patient monitoring as, you know, part of kind of the wave of the future, the way that we will be providing care to patients and families. And this public health emergency is one thing, but certainly the other part of this is that, you know, it certainly is what we'll be seeing into the future. And certainly CMS also saying very anxious to minimize the overall risk. And for me, that was also very, very good to see that it's not just the risk to patients, it's the risk to staff, it's the risk to the general public and all of that. So, all right. And so then this is where that originating site, these are the other requirements that were waived. Here's the restriction, the restriction on the use of a phone is waived for telehealth. And so all of that is a part of what this interim final rule says. Now, another thing just to make sure of is that this interim final rule has an effective date of March the 1st, 2020. And I'm conferring with my colleagues who are also on the line to confirm that. Annie?
Yes, Annie just looked.
Correct.
Yep.
I just
All right.
double checked and the rule has an effective date of March 1, 2020.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much. All right, let's keep going and we'll take a look at the cost of if your hospice needs to buy telecommunications technology, you're buying some iPads, you're buying some iPhones, you're buying some equipment that you can use in order to talk with patients and see them as well. Those are costs that can be put on your cost report. And this would be an acceptable expense for with the cost center being PHE for COVID-19. All right, next slide, please. So I want to stop here and just see if we've got a lot of questions in the Q&A box, and I want to maybe stop for maybe 5 minutes or so. Let's see what kind of questions we have.
Thanks, Judy. We're just pulling a couple of questions. Some of the ones that we've answered already, I'll go over those first, and then we'll ask a couple of the outstanding ones. So again, there are a few questions on whether audio-only telephonic face-to-face encounters will be accepted. And as we previously stated, CMS on a call earlier today said that telephonic only will count. This is not as clear in the rule and the guidance that was issued. I think that probably because the preference is to have audio and visual capabilities, but they did state on the call earlier today that telephone only will count. We'll also continue to get a lot of questions about whether the slides will be available on the recording. Yes, the slides and the recording will both be posted. I encourage you to look at nhpco.org/coronavirus for updates. We will be posting additional information on that page.
Now, we should also say that we've got we send an update out on COVID-19 almost every day. And I think we've been doing like 6 days a week for the last 2 weeks. So if you're not signed up for that special mailing list, there is a way to sign up for that on the COVID-19 page as well. So if you go to nhpco.org, it's right there on the home pages.
Okay, so sorry about the glitch. This is one of our challenges of all working remote, I believe. So my apologies. All right, let's take a look at the blanket waiver specs. This one is March 1, 2020 retro, and then let's go on to the next slide. So there are several things that CMS has added to the blanket waiver list that came out yesterday. The first one is a waiver for the use of volunteers in hospice during the pandemic. So we've had a lot of questions from providers saying, what am I going to do about my volunteers? I need to be able to meet the 5% requirement. My volunteers are nervous or they're elderly and at risk themselves. So is it okay if they do phone calls and not make personal visits? And so CMS, we asked for this, NHPCO in the many letters we sent to CMS asking for a waiver, blanket waiver authority for hospice. This was one of the things that was always on the list. So I'm pleased that that made it onto the list as a final. Next slide, please. And then we've also wanted to make sure that we were thinking about the time frames for the initial and the comprehensive assessment, the update to the plan of care, the update to the comprehensive assessment. This one is moves the updating, gives a little bit of extra time from 15 days to 21 days, and it is a waiver that will also be extended throughout the national emergency. This doesn't mean that you shouldn't do this or can't do this, but it does mean you must continue to do the required updates and assessment, but you, in this case, you have a bit more time. Next slide, please. So in this one, we are not seeing that CMS has waived all non-core services, but it would make sense that these three, physical therapy, occupational therapy, and speech language pathology, would all be waived for the time period of the pandemic. Not used that often in hospice, but still it's a waiver for this. Next slide, please. So this is one that we asked for. I know in a lot of my conversations with state leaders as well, what are we going to do about supervising the aides? The patient doesn't need all those people in the home. The patient doesn't need, may not need the nurse. And really, what are we going to do? And so CMS, both for home health and for hospice, has waived the on-site supervisory visit requirement every 2 weeks for hospice aides. And so this will be also in place for the time of the pandemic. Next slide, please. So then there are a couple of things. Those are the four that just apply to hospice. And so then there are things that apply to hospice and other provider types as well, and this is one of them. So accelerated or advanced payments, if your hospice is having disruption in claim submission or claims processing, during this public health emergency, you can apply to your MAC to get a relief, accelerated payments, advanced payments, with a pretty long window for repayment. So NHPCO did a separate regulatory alert on this. And you can also go to the fact sheet that's at the bottom of your screen here to get more information on this. We did go to each of the MACs, I think at the end of last week when this came out, and have links in the regulatory alert to each MAC and how you go through the process. Of course, each of them has a little bit of a different twist, so pay attention depending on what MAC you normally use. Next slide, please. So I've heard from a few providers who said, well, I'm not ever going to be able to qualify for this because I don't meet one of these qualifying requirements. So you have to build within the last 180 days. You can't be in bankruptcy. You can't be under active medical review or program integrity investigation. And you can't have any outstanding delinquent Medicare overpayments. So those are the four requirements that they don't apply just to hospice, they apply across the board. But that's where that is at this point. Next slide, please. Another thing that CMS has given the MACs and the QUICs some flexibility is around appeals. And so I won't go through all of these, but you can see extensions to file an appeal, extensions for additional information, filing an appeal, even when you don't have all the information from the various appointment of representative and all of that form. And even when you don't have all the required elements, you're doing the best you can. And so, I think this is also very helpful to some providers who might be in this situation at this point. Next slide, please. Finally, cost report deadlines have been extended. So I know many of you are on a fiscal year of January 1, December 31. So now your cost report has 2 extra months before it's due, and the July 31 deadline. Some of the cost report preparers we've been talking to say they're still going to work to get your cost report done as quickly as they can, but having the extra time I think is going to be very helpful while we're really focused on many, many other things. Next slide, please. And then finally, we've got, these are all our links. This is all the different rules that we used when we were putting together this slide set for today. So the comprehensive list of blanket waivers, and then the third one, the 1135 waiver flexibilities for hospices, has everything that's in this set of slides, but it also gives you a little bit more detail on exactly what's going on and what kinds of things that are applying to hospice, but also to other providers as well. And then if you really want to see it with your own 2 eyes, the provider burden relief FAQs is the document from CMS, also issued yesterday, that is coming out, that came out with the suspension of audits and TPEs and audits from some of the other Medicare contractors. So that is that. I think we are ready now for questions. Annie, do you want to share? I know we have a lot of questions about telehealth and claims, so maybe we should start with that as the answer you were just posting.
Yeah, I'm happy to, Judy. Thank you. So there's been a lot of questions about recording telehealth visits on claims. And I'm going to read everyone a quote from CMS from the call that we were on earlier. So you do not put a telehealth visit on the claim only if in-person visits are on the claim. CMS is limited in reimbursing for in-person only visits for the home health benefit. But in the rule and guidance that was issued yesterday, CMS is exercising as much flexibility as they can to allow telehealth to occur, but there still needs to be some in-person visits to render payment. I will note that we plan on following up with CMS regarding this, and we'll submit feedback with our concerns. Judy, anything I missed?
Well, and the other thing, this is coming from Hillary Leffler at CMS payment policy, and she does both home health and hospice. So the same answer applies to both home health and hospice, which helps us, I think, in some ways. But she also said that that CMS does not have the statutory authority to render payment for anything besides an in-person visit. So it goes right directly to what the statutory authority is, which is the harder thing to change of all the things we're working on.
Thanks, Judy.
Judy and Annie, there's been several questions about, with the extension of the comprehensive assessment to every 21 days, does that impact then the frequency of the interdisciplinary team meeting or group meeting? Do we know?
I don't think we know. I think one of the things that we can say about what we're seeing with CMS right now is they want to give providers as much flexibility as possible. So if your team meets every 2 weeks and that's working for you while you're doing that virtually, then there is no reason to change your team meeting because you have this additional flexibility for this. You know, I think it gives you the flexibility. It doesn't mean you have to take it. And I think in this case, it's great to have it. In the telehealth and televisit case, it's absolutely essential to have it. So just my own reflection, I guess, as we've been talking to CMS on a daily, hourly basis about a lot of the issues that we've identified.
Another question we're still getting a lot of is the fact that there's just some nursing homes, assisted livings where there's all visits are blocked. So even the extension to 21 days doesn't allow for an in-person visit. And so the question is, what should we be doing with those patients? And I think we've been encouraging not to discharge, correct?
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that we're seeing from state survey agencies and from CMS is, you know, do the best you can. Do the right thing for your patients and families. Do the best you can. Document why you did what you did, and you know we have to just sort it out as we go. We've had a lot of internal conversation at NHPCO about how to like handle the nursing home that doesn't allow visits, or the nursing home that only says to the nurse, you can come in once every 14 days or whatever your absolute requirement is, but nothing else. So I know a lot of providers are being very creative, and I know probably Lori, you and Annie can talk about some of the things we've seen on email over the last couple of weeks as well. So, but I think that the end of the day, it's do the best you can and document why you did it. So I think that's probably.
Thanks, Judy. It looks like a couple of people may have joined late, and they're asking if the recording and the slides will be available. Yes, they will be posted. NHPCO has a dedicated site to COVID-19 updates, so please check back for that. I'm also seeing additional questions about when are the telehealth visits effective, and again, the regulations are effective as of March 1st, 2020.
What other questions do we have?
I also keep seeing a few questions about confusion between Part A and Part B. So just to clarify, palliative care visits that are billable, which would be a physician, nurse practitioner, physician assistant, or clinical nurse specialist under Part B, are not what we're talking about here, right? Those visits can be billed. We'll get into that more in another webinar, but today we're really focused on the telehealth waiver in hospice, which is Part A.
Correct. Right. And I think some of our billing questions, and it will be so helpful if you wanted to send your physician billing questions our way as we are navigating that with both the MACs and with CMS to try and sort out exactly how the direct patient care, when there's a face-to-face, how that will work, because we have different guidelines now on the Part B side. So all of your questions will really help us get some clarity that was so desperately needed.
Another question that I'm seeing is, can you please confirm that CMS is not requiring a special consent from the patient or caregiver to provide services via telehealth? And in looking at the guidance that was released yesterday, it is okay to proceed with telehealth if consent would interfere with the timely provision of the services.
Right. We're not seeing anything that requires consent during this national emergency.
Judy and Lori, another question I'm looking at here, interested in your response to this is, because of this, should hospices be encouraging telehealth visits instead of in-person visits?
I'll start, Lori, but would love your clinical expertise on it as well. I think in this time, we absolutely should be encouraging telehealth visits. And I know the providers we've been talking to are providers who say, We are being very, very careful about triaging who needs an in-person visit, and we send staff to do those in-person visits, but we are also, very careful about our PPE and very careful about exposure. So Lori, maybe you have a nurse thought on that for sure.
Yeah, thanks, Judy. And I would just echo what you just said for all of those reasons. I think you do want to be very strategic about using telehealth visits to minimize the risk to your patients and to your staff, and to minimize your use of PPE. And then, of course, you want to put some clarity around what constitutes an essential visit in person. That might help your staff to figure out when a nursing visit is essential, obviously when there's any direct patient care that needs to happen. What about when is it essential for a social worker or a chaplain? I think you will need to kind of help define that for your staff, but I think you do want to be judicious in how many in-person visits you make, and minimize those as much as possible without sacrificing quality of care.
Great.
We've got a long way to go yet here in this.
Yeah, we do.
In this pandemic.
Yeah, we do. We do. I want to go back to a question that I'm seeing on both the in the Q&A about PAs, and just to make sure that we are really clear about that. PAs are not currently allowed to do a face-to-face encounter, and whether it's telehealth or in person, neither are allowed. It requires a change in the statute, and one of the things we've been talking about is whether or not we try to get that done while all this other legislative work is happening. But just to make sure that we are crystal clear that PAs are not allowed to do the face-to-face either telephonically or in person. The other thing that's sort of connected to that, and often these questions kind of come together, is the other question about who can certify and recertify for terminal illness. It is the MD or the DO, period. The nurse practitioner cannot, the PA cannot, the APRN cannot, any other kind of advanced practice nurse. It is the physician, MD or DO only. And that will also require a statutory change. So both of those things, just so that we are completely clear on that.
And Judy, I think it would probably be good to go back to slide 13 and just go over claims and billing one more time. I'm still seeing quite a few questions come in. And as we get to that slide, I see a question asking if a provider needs to file for the 1135 waiver, and the answer is no. Now that this blanket waiver has been issued, individual states and providers do not need to apply for it.
That is correct. Thank you for answering that one. Hope, can we go back to slide 13, please? All right, so what we have and what we're really trying to sort out is on the Part B side, when a physician does a visit and uses the physician fee schedule code, there's a way to get paid, they file their claim and all of that. And so in some ways it feels like the physicians who bill the hospice or who bill the hospice through Part A are sort of left out of this whole discussion. And so that's part of what we've been trying to work with CMS on. So we've got how does a physician who bills the hospice through Part A get paid? That's one question we don't know the answer to. Another part of the question is on the Part B side, they have now a service code of 02, which signifies that the visit is a telehealth visit. We don't have a place to put a service code of 02 on the Part A form or billing form. So that's another question that we're trying to figure out how to handle. And so, you know, the face-to-face visit is not reimbursable as just a administrative requirement. If there are patient care needs that the patient needs while a face-to-face visit, either telephonically or through in person, then we've got then we don't know exactly on the Part A side exactly how that's going to work. So I think we're starting, I would say the calls with CMS today are starting to give us a little bit more clarity, but we're not anywhere close to having like, here's what you do, here's when you do it. We're just not there yet. So apologies for that. And, you know, it will help us so much if you tell us, here's our question about physician billing, because then we can start to hone in on exactly where the issues might be.
We've gotten a lot of good ones today.
Yeah, definitely. That's so helpful.
So Judy, one of the things I'm hearing is that we kind of understand we can put them on the cost report, but we can't really put them on the bill. Is that correct?
Well, the cost report only reflects the cost of the equipment. So the cost report visits are going to come from the claim form. So neither place does it matter.
Okay.
Because you're not putting the virtual visits or telehealth visits on the claim form.
Just the cost of the equipment to do those?
Correct.
Thank
and
you.
now the other part of the question, I think, is, okay, so we have no virtual visits, but we need to keep track of them in our EMR. Will our EMR allow us to keep track of them in the EMR without putting them on the claim form? So that's sort of another part to this question I heard this morning. So just sharing that.
Yeah, so there is a key to kind of finding a way to keep track at this point, right? So that you
right.
Can, yeah.
Exactly. All right, and I think we've covered Zoom, Skype, that sort of thing as well. And we've posted the Office of Civil Rights allowances for flexibility in terms of audiovisual communication, two-way communication as well. So that's another possibility there.
Thanks so much, Judy, and thanks to everybody for joining. As a reminder, we will be posting this recording and the slides. I am putting in the chat box right now the direct link to our coronavirus webpage on NHPCO. So please stay tuned there for updates and to receive these resources. We will be concluding the call, but again, just want to say thank you to everyone. Special thanks to Judy and to Lori. We really appreciate it, and we really appreciate all of the work that you all are doing every day. So thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.